switch my camera on. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Campos. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the hidden costs of deprioritizing diversity in user research. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work at MadPow, we are a UX agency that leverages strategic design and the psychology of motivation to create innovative experiences and compelling digital solutions that are good for people and good for business. We work with health leaders to understand behavior and inspire change both inside and outside the organization. And we do this through experience innovation, behavior change, and digital solutions. A couple of instructions just for using the GoToWebinar interface while you're here. This talk is going to go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll end with 10 or so minutes of Q&A. If you have a question during the session, please enter your questions into the question box. And then if you run out of time, I'm going to share both my Twitter handle and my email address. Feel free to email me directly. So I'll start by sharing a little bit more about myself. I'm experienced research director at MadPow. Our research team designs, conducts, and analyzes usability studies and user research in verticals that include finance, education, and healthcare. Before I came to MadPow, I got my master's in human factors and information design from Bentley University. And today's topic probably has its roots in my own interest in the nuances of identity. I'm a person of Puerto Rican and Irish descent, so race and ethnicity have been particularly fascinating to me personally. I applied that interest as an undergrad to my degree in sociology, which then led me to write a thesis on cultural capital and racial identity. So all of those interests have entered into my developing approach to user research recruitment, which is what I'm going to be sharing with all of you today. Couple of quick caveats up front. As a team at MadPow, we are always examining our practices and how we can improve them to better serve our clients and their users. So really the end goal of this talk is to keep expanding the scope of that conversation and learn together. I also want to be upfront and say that while I'm going to offer some potential approaches to addressing the problem space, I am by no means saying I have the solution. I think this is a conversation we need to keep having and keep iterating on and keep evolving. You'll notice that the focus of the talk today is on race, and that's because it's the most salient aspect of diversity for me personally. But I want to be really clear, when I talk about the need for diversity in our user research recruits, I'm talking about race, but also sex, gender, economic status, social status, education level, disability, and others. And another note on race, I'm going to be using the term Black in place of terms like African American because I want to be inclusive of people who may come from countries other than Africa. However, in instances where I'm quoting participants directly, I'll use their preferred words to describe themselves. Last thing, I'm going to try to avoid using the term underrepresented here. When we talk about the need to diversify our recruiting pools, we're talking about increasing the representative numbers for communities who are frequently absent or excluded from research. But the result actually serves to misrepresent these communities and individuals. When we do this, we center the point of view of the dominant characteristics, demographics, and cultures, and then we assume or ignore the needs of those we never speak to. So to start, I want to talk about how I got to the topic of this presentation specifically. When I was starting my career in UX research, I noticed that all of our screeners called for a mix of criteria like race, gender, household income, and education level. But the more studies I was involved in, the more I noticed that when we asked for a mix, we actually got a homogeneous list of participants, people who were mostly white, mostly middle class, always cisgendered, and mostly fully employed or supported by a fully employed significant other. We always had reasons why we couldn't push for a more diverse recruit, usually that it didn't seem like those factors had a real impact on the experiences and behaviors that we were studying specifically. But the evidence shows us that our individual mixes of demographic criteria do have an impact on how we experience the world and on how the world experiences us. There are essays, books, journal articles, blog posts, news stories, and tweets that have captured how the world looks different depending on the color of your skin. If you're cisgendered or not cisgendered, if you're heterosexual or LGBTQIA+, if you're of low, middle, or upper economic class. Everything from the way you're treated when you walk into a store, to the kind of healthcare you can expect to receive, to an everyday conversation with an acquaintance can be shaped in visible or invisible ways by your individual demographic makeup. To cite a recent and very top-of-mind example, you may have seen the concerning statistics about how the lack of medical access afforded to Black communities in the United States has resulted in those communities being underserved and ultimately severely and uniquely impacted by the coronavirus. Viruses don't discriminate based on race, but our healthcare system does. And sometimes that only becomes apparent to the rest of the world in times where that system is stressed in new and unusually lethal ways. So thinking about these kinds of different experiences, I realized that we may want to reconsider how we approach getting that demographic mix in our participant recruits, particularly when it comes to user research efforts. But first, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the only person seeing this trend in my participants, so like a good researcher, I ran a survey. My survey asked people who conduct user research to tell me which criteria matter most to them in recruiting, in which they felt they could be flexible about when, for instance, the recruit timeline ran into the study dates. I also asked how researchers think about components of demographic criteria like gender, sex, and race. The people I interviewed indicated that they conduct user research on a regular basis and are involved in or in charge of the creation of recruitment screeners. The link for the survey was sent out to my and my coworkers' personal and professional networks, including organizations like UXPA and Research Ops Slack. A quick look at who completed the survey. 72% were women, 26% were male, and 2% were non-binary. 81% of respondents were white, 12% were Asian, 5% were 2 or more races, and 2% were American Indian or Pacific Islander. 7% were ethnically Hispanic or Latino. So if we're talking about diversity in demographics, it's fair to say that my respondents for this survey were fairly homogeneous: cisgendered female, white, and highly educated in a variety of fields. At a high level, the survey results indicated that demographic criteria is generally considered to be less important compared to parts of the screener like project-specific criteria and contextual information. Here we have from left to right demographic criteria, contextual criteria, project criteria, and measures of articulation. I'm showing the number of responses for each from not important, which is the left-hand navy blue bar, to very important, which is the right-hand turquoise bar. The next thing that became apparent was that there is a hierarchy of importance within demographic criteria. I asked researchers to tell me where each component fell on a scale from not at all important to very important, specifically in the context of user research. I asked researchers to tell me where each component fell in this context, and I offered them from left to right race, ethnicity, gender, sex, age, location, profession, income, and disability status. For each, I'm showing the cumulative number of responses from not at all important, which is the left-hand purple bar, to very important, which is the right-hand yellow bar. So you can see here, race, ethnicity, gender, and sex are considered to be less important than other demographic criteria. They have a higher number of responses indicating that they're either not at all important or slightly important, as indicated by the purple and blue bars here. On the other side, we can see which criteria was considered to be very important or important, represented by the yellow and turquoise bars. Location, profession, household income, education level, and disability status have a more middling degree of importance, and age received the most very important ratings. So what I find most interesting, and maybe it's obvious about the hierarchy we see, is that those criteria that have more invisible economic, social, and political structures around them are on the less important end, while those with very visible structures emerged on the middling or high importance end. If we go back to our earlier example, the structures that create an inequitable experience for Black people during a global pandemic may not be particularly visible if you're not a member of that demographic. Whereas age, which is something we can all see and understand and experience, carries with it obvious differences in lived experience. We'll talk about the assumptions we make about people who do not share our identity in a bit, but I also think that here, we're creating a ranked order based on our ability to confidently point to a characteristic and assign it a higher or lower importance value. There was this pervasive belief not that long ago that we're living in a post-racial era. Phrases like "I don't see color" were everywhere, and really they're still everywhere, despite clear evidence to the contrary. My hypothesis is that because many of us want to believe that items 6 through 8 here, gender, ethnicity, sex, and race, don't have an impact on our lived experience and the experiences we can easily observe, they must not matter as much. Because to acknowledge the impact is to acknowledge and become increasingly aware of inequality. We're comfortable saying there are probably differences in a person's experience based on their occupation, but far less comfortable saying that a person's gender or their race might noticeably and measurably impact the way they move through the world. The more we see inequality, the worse it feels. So we're conditioned to move away from it and ignore it when we're allowed to. I also asked respondents to tell me more specifically what they look for when it comes to the numbers they aim to recruit within demographic criteria. As you can see, there's a lot of leeway given to demographic criteria. 47% of respondents ask for a non-specific mix, relying on the recruiter to determine what that means specifically. And 16% don't ask for any demographic criteria at all. That makes sense if you consider the hierarchy we just looked at. Why be too particular if you don't think what you're asking for is important? Why ask for it at all? When we look at flexibility, every single respondent who asks for any demographic criteria at all also displays some flexibility with the numbers they initially ask for. 51% are flexible, 43% are a little flexible, and 6% are very flexible. In my own experience, I used to fall into that middle, a little flexible category, but as I'll describe later, I found that asking for a specific minimum number in demographic criteria most pertinent to the study is the most effective way to ensure a degree of diversity in the user research recruit. I also gave respondents the opportunity for open response about how they thought about their practices regarding demographic criteria and recruits. Generally, what I heard fell into two camps. Demographics don't shape behavior, and we know we're doing the best we can. Both of these points, I think, illustrate how difficult it can be to recruit for diversity, but it also tells us why it's so important. Let's start with the idea that demographics don't shape behavior. A number of verbatim quotes here. We don't really need demographics. We focus more on behaviors and experiences because it doesn't matter too much to us about things like gender, race, etc., as long as the participants fit our other behavioral criteria. We've talked about this a little bit already. I can maybe see the case for this if we're talking about B2B research or even some usability studies, but when it comes to user research, in-depth interviews, ethnography, diary studies, and so on, we are not talking to people in a vacuum. Who they are as a person and the experiences they've lived through are usually very relevant to the goals of the study. If we decide certain demographics don't matter and continue with homogeneous recruits, we're essentially giving into the systems and structures that sustain inequality. We're effectively deciding to ignore differences that irrefutably and significantly impact everyday and lifelong lived experiences for every individual. We can't pretend that the people we talk to have behaviors, attitudes, and experiences that are separate from the identities that our society attaches to them. We can't possibly separate the factors we study from the characteristics of the people we talk to because, again, in invisible and highly visible ways, that isn't how our social structures let us live our lives. We may wish that we could do research and create solutions agnostic of things like race or ethnicity or sex or gender, but our job is to understand people's real lived experience, and that means acknowledging the holistic person, including the environments in which they live. And if we just decide to ignore these shapers of behavior, experience, and attitude, we're missing huge swaths of the participant experience and an opportunity to better serve our users. So let's talk about the second sentiment, that we're aware of these differentiated experiences, but we can only do the best we can. Some quotes here. I might budge a little bit as long as there is some representation, even if it's not the number I initially targeted. It's less important than the timeline slipping. Perfection in a recruit can sometimes be a tall order. Yeah, agreed. Our best is what we can and should be doing. But shouldn't our best be open to improvement and evolution? Shouldn't we constantly evaluate our practices to see if there are ways we can better serve the breadth of our clients' target audiences or our target audiences? I would say that if we do recognize that demographics can shape behavior in significant ways, We need to be willing to shift our perspective and adjust our practices. The products, services, and experiences we study are made better by our observations of their nuances, challenges, and barriers. Shouldn't we apply that same willingness and desire to engage with opportunities to improve our own practices? Stagnation isn't good for everyone at best and can actively do a disservice to our users at worst. I want to give you some specific examples of why it can be important to recruit diverse user research participants. The MadPow team completed a user research study on healthcare experiences of independent adults in Massachusetts. While nothing in our project goals was race specific, we knew that healthcare experiences in the United States are stratified along racial lines. Some examples of that stratification to add on to the earlier COVID-19 headlines: Black women have a higher risk of pregnancy-related death than white women. Non-white people are more likely to not have health insurance and are more likely to be underdiagnosed and underprescribed on a national scale. Black people are more prone to certain chronic diseases at younger ages. There are also many, many accounts of feeling as if a doctor is treating a patient who is not white as incompetent or exaggerating their symptoms. So we set a specific quota saying that we wanted to see at least 5 people who are not white among our participants. That number was pulled from the existing user population breakdown, which actually reflected the census data showing that roughly 35% of the United States identifies as a race that is not white. Ultimately, the recruiter came back to us more than once with full participant lists that included 1, then 2, then 3 people who were not white, until we ultimately had to say specifically that the racial quota was not intended to be flexible. In the end, we had 6 participants who identified as a race other than white. It's not that these 6 participants had totally different experiences from the white participants. Also, people who aren't white aren't a monolith. Their experiences were in themselves different from one another in really significant ways. But their personal stories did contain crucial distinctions that reflect larger national trends. We heard awareness of and anxiety about the trend I mentioned earlier of non-white folks being underprescribed and underdiagnosed. We heard about the difficulty of finding a Black doctor, even in a city as densely populated with medical professionals as Boston, and especially the difficulty of finding a Black female doctor. To quote one participant, well, my first priority was female, African American. It's not that any person of any race would be any lesser quality, it's just comforting to find someone who can relate to you, particularly in healthcare where African Americans are underprescribed and underdiagnosed. One participant said that he felt his doctor dismissed and ignored him due to his race, especially when he compared his experiences to those of his wife, who's white. To paraphrase, he said, being a Black man does tend to influence your healthcare experience. I find that doctors do not give as much attention to me as they do to my wife. I find that they have the expectation that you're more resistant and there's more focus given to white first in healthcare as a patient. These differences weren't rooted in profession or age, the top of our demographic hierarchy from earlier. They were rooted in these participants' experiences navigating the healthcare system as a Black man and a Black woman. And these differences are important. There are literally lives at stake when we're talking about inequality in medicine. We often hear large-scale reporting on structural inequality, but these interviews gave us the opportunity to dig into personal stories and start to craft solutions that directly address those pain points, which we would not have been able to do had we not made a specific effort to recruit people who are not white. I also want to acknowledge that it's sometimes neither easy nor expedient to aim explicitly for diversity in user research recruits, even when the project goals clearly call for it, or a niche group of people. A team at MadPow was hired to examine an accountable care organization, which is a partnership between healthcare providers and insurance providers. In this case, the insurance provider was focused on the Medicaid population in certain regions of Massachusetts. As part of the partnership, if a patient had a primary care physician, a PCP, at one of the participating healthcare providers, all of their care would eventually be transitioned to that provider network after a limited waiting period. During the waiting period, patients had the ability to shop around and decide whether or not they wanted to move all their care over to the one network, so it was important for our client to give those people a consistently good experience to retain them as patients. For this study, the team focused on high-risk, low-income participants, people on Medicaid who were likely to utilize hospital services out of necessity. In meetings with stakeholders, it became clear that there were 3 non-English language groups to consider: Spanish speakers, Khmer speakers, and Portuguese speakers. They recruited within the existing care educator network, and because they insisted on sticking to the language requirements, they ended up with a group that looked a bit different from your standard user research recruit. Low income, high medical risk, non-English speaking, and largely non-white. I should note that this population makes up maybe 20% of the accountable care organization's population, but they agreed that it was important to talk to this group to better understand their needs and their differences so that they could provide them with the best possible care and service. Stakeholders started with the hypothesis that there would be a clear difference in their interactions and behaviors in the hospital setting, and that those differences would break out along cultural lines. Recruitment was not easy. Well, within the population provided by the care educator, several potential participants were homeless. Many spoke little or no English at all. All suffered from significant chronic health concerns. Before and during the study, the team had to continually reassess their materials, including things like the consent form and the moderator's guide, to ensure that participants, translators, and medical staff had the access to information they needed. Logistics were complicated, not only for recruitment, but also for moderation of the study itself. The team needed to work with professional translators and needed to basically camp out at the hospital for entire days to ensure that they met the population where they were, made it easy for them. In the end, the team didn't validate or invalidate the stakeholders' assumption that there would be clear differences along cultural lines. Instead, the team found that there are clear and specific differences between this group as a whole and the average Massachusetts patient. English language proficiency, degree of engagement with medical care, recency to the country, and access to resources all presented far more salient influences on the patient experience. This experience demonstrated to the team the extreme importance of working towards inclusivity in healthcare. And that means understanding the people you serve, which means making a special effort to meet them where they are. It's not enough to approach every population with the same set of practices and assumptions. Those same practices and assumptions only yield and then serve the average person. I also want to quickly point out the tactics that this team used to recruit a population that fell outside the participant norm. They used a care educator who was already a trusted connection for a vulnerable population. They stationed themselves in a place that was comfortable, accessible, and familiar to the participants they wanted to speak to. And they made sure to plan their materials in advance to accommodate the needs of the participants, like having a medical translator on site. The business side takeaway from both these 2 case studies is that when you take into account the needs of a typically misrepresented group, the solutions you come up with are likely to make the experience better for the broader target audience. In the first case study, we were able to make suggestions about how to help misrepresented audiences find healthcare providers that could make them feel more comfortable, and also talked about the need to instill effective cultural competency training that would do more than just cover the bases. Well, this solution was specifically crafted to serve the needs of the people who are not white. It also serves the interest of the younger participants we spoke to, who expressed an interest in searching for PCPs and behavioral health specialists by other demographic criteria. In the second study, researchers were able to tell stakeholders that understanding the needs of a specific culture was a less immediate need than learning to appropriately serve the needs of low-income, new to the country, non-English speakers who may be adjusting to a whole new set of expectations for how they should approach healthcare. By including this group in their care model, the organization is lowering the barrier for a wide percentage of their population who may not be new to the country, but may lack the adequate background to fully engage with their healthcare experience. When I broach this subject with other people in the field and around the office, I've also been asked to share examples of studies where we didn't yield a demographically diverse recruit and what we missed as a result. I dug through my own research portfolio and I reached out to my colleagues, and the conclusion I've come to is that we don't know what we missed. We don't know what needs, desires, challenges, pain points we might have discovered had we sought out racial diversity or economic diversity or access diversity in the participant group we recruited. We can't ask questions of or co-create with these people because we're excluding them from the conversation entirely. So it's difficult to say with accuracy what we missed, but my colleague at MadPow offered some examples that help us understand where things can go wrong, hypotheses about where our blind spots are, and clarity around the dangers of making assumptions. One colleague shared an example where the recruit was homogeneous, all or almost all white people who spoke English fluently, despite a clear need for racial and linguistic diversity, and what they hypothesized they missed as a result. In this example, the MadPow team was tasked with determining whether a health insurance provider's member welcome packet provided clear instructions for what they needed to do once they signed up for a plan. The insurance provider's population was about 20% white and 80% not white, with many people who spoke Spanish as their primary or only language. So the MadPow team queued up their recruit to weight the population towards participants who are not white. The first hurdle they ran into was the client's objection to the cost of a Spanish-speaking moderator. Ultimately, they had to remove that as a contingency in the project plan. Also, despite a significant lead-up time, the recruiter ultimately turned around a participant list that was mostly white. One participant was Asian and another Hispanic. Everyone spoke English fluently. In short, the recruit was not at all representative of the provider's population. The findings from the study demonstrated that generally folks understood what the insurance welcome packet was telling them and asking them to do. They found very minimal issues with comprehension. When I asked my colleague to describe the impact of having a homogeneous recruit that was absent, especially of non-English speakers, she couldn't say anything with certainty. She described a list of assumptions informed by her expertise, research, and client knowledge about what wasn't heard as a result of the recruit yield. She talked about not hearing from immigrant communities that might be concerned about information disclosure, about cultural barriers to seeking healthcare, about language comprehension for people who did not speak English fluently or at all. None of this may have come up or been an issue, but we don't know. We don't know that one way or the other. And so we can't solve for any barriers that exist for these people. And all we get if we think about people who aren't white at all is a set of assumptions that not only doesn't have a basis in stated fact, but serves to further otherize those groups by treating the people we do talk to as the norm. We didn't talk to them, we didn't hear their stories, so they're excluded from the scope of our recommendations. There are also instances where the directives from the client or the stakeholders make it difficult to recruit participants who accurately reflect the user population. Another colleague described a project where the MadPow research team was tasked with understanding why financially well-off patients weren't paying their medical bills at all or on time. So people who had financial ability, but for some reason weren't paying their medical bills on time or at all. The goal was to develop solutions for this specific behavior that would help these patients pay their bills before they were sent to collections. The first issue will sound familiar by now. Despite being asked to yield a racially diverse group, the recruiter continuously struggled, and ultimately, the final participant list was 100% white. This is extra egregious because the city the research was being conducted in has a racial makeup that was 53% Black at the time. Second, the client insisted on conducting the interviews in the participants' homes and being in the room while the interviews were being conducted. I'll note here that there's a long history of earned mistrust between the client organization and the Black community in this particular city. Not only was the methodology unnecessary, because the interviews could easily have been conducted over the phone, but the presence of representatives from that organization made it more unlikely that Black participants would be willing to consent to the interviews. The last concern was that the client made a list of eligible neighborhoods and opted to prioritize participants from those neighborhoods. The assumption was that if someone lived in a wealthy neighborhood, they most likely did not have financial barriers that were preventing them from paying their medical bills. In addition to narrowing the breadth of the potential participant pool, this basically limited the pool to people who live in a highly segregated, wealthy white neighborhood. In addition to excluding a large swath of the Black population this way, this also meant that the recruit yielded folks who lived in wealthy neighborhoods but had other responses that indicated financial difficulties, something the study was specifically aiming to avoid. The results of this study showed the perils of relying on assumptions and of not enforcing the parameters of the recruit. While the client thought that recruiting from wealthy neighborhoods would remove the participants with financial concerns from the list, The team talked to at least one person whose living situation belied intense financial struggle. He lived in a large house in a nice neighborhood, but had lost his job and was barely making ends meet beyond paying the mortgage. The study yielded specifically the population they were aiming to exclude, likely at the expense of recruiting a sample that better reflected the city's population. We all know what happens when you assume, and in this case, the impact could be felt during the recruit and seen in the results of the study. So what can we do to ensure that our user research participants are diverse, not homogeneous? I'll discuss the initial approach that's been working for me, some suggestions based on past experiences, and some strategies we might employ from analogous fields so that we can start to have a conversation about how to work towards a more inclusive recruitment solution. A quick note that at MadPow, we typically use a third party to conduct our research, so a recruiter, and that's the primary lens I'm using to look at this problem. The first approach that has so far worked best for me is to get specific in your asks for third-party recruiters. When I asked in the survey about whether demographic criteria is a consideration and how specific we are with our asks, I found that 47% of researchers surveyed asked for a mix. And while some, 28%, do get specific with their demographic asks, more than half are flexible or very flexible with their numbers. No one was inflexible. We're often specific and quite demanding when it comes to, for instance, ensuring that someone has not participated in a user research study in the last X number of months, or making sure they have the right insurance plan. If we accept that demographics do shape the experiences we study, why shouldn't we be as specific and as demanding when it comes to meeting those representative quotas? I found that when I ask for a specific minimum, say at least 3 people in a certain racial category, and make clear upfront that it's not a suggestion, I get what I ask for. I think that recruiters have become conditioned to treat demographic asks as flexible or optional, and I want to say here that I don't think they should if we're really trying to get at representatively diverse sets of experiences. Another approach for those of you who use third-party recruiters is to screen the recruiters themselves early in the process. If you go into a study knowing that you want to recruit a diverse participant pool, be upfront in your conversation with the recruiter. Outline the specifics of what you're asking for and ask if they can do it. Ask if they can meet those needs. If they can't or if they have doubts, push back. And if that doesn't work, consider moving on to a different recruiter who can execute your request. Think of it a little bit like a job interview. You wouldn't hire a team member who can't deliver, so don't hire a recruiter who can't get the job done accurately. This is maybe your best opportunity as a researcher to make a difference in this area, because your recruiters are only likely to make a change when they're incentivized by you, the person coming back to them for each study and paying them at the end of the day. I'd even go so far as to say that if seeing a diverse participant pool is important to you, it's your responsibility to make sure your recruiter sees it as a priority too. For friends and family recruits or other guerrilla research, consider who you're reaching out to. Many people have networks that look a lot like them socioeconomically and often racially. If I want to find someone who does not align with my demographics, I probably need to go outside my network. That means going into communities outside my own, using platforms and mediums I may not be familiar with, and tailoring my efforts to appeal to a broader audience. There are many researchers, couple listed here, who have already done excellent work on doing this kind of outreach, both conscientiously and safely. So the premise of this talk rests on my experience of yielding participants who are mostly white, cisgender, and economically middle class or higher. Maybe it's not surprising then that the UX research community tends to be similarly homogeneous. This means that whether we acknowledge it or not, many of us are operating from a similar position of privilege. For the purposes of this talk, I want to suggest that on top of the many other benefits of hiring a diverse team of researchers, doing so might help you spot barriers to entry for participants who don't typically get recruited adequately for user research. Finally, we can start to look at analogous industries and fields in an effort to understand the practices and strategies they employ to try and yield a diverse recruitment pool. For this talk, I looked at recruitment in clinical trials for medication. In clinical trials, hitting recruiting numbers and deadlines is critical to acquiring funding and ensuring that scientific regulations are adhered to. Diversity is a problem here too. In fact, it took an NIH mandate in 1993 to require the inclusion of women and non-white people at all in clinical trials research, and an amendment in 2001 to include differences in sex and gender identification. The FDA declared 2016 the year of inclusion in clinical trials in an effort to increase representation in participant groups. They had some suggestions for recruitment and enrollment, and I'll share those here and discuss how we might adapt them for user research recruitment. The first is to consider what recruit criteria you have that might exclude certain populations unnecessarily. This includes criteria like measures of educational achievement, whose value is conferred upon them by a socioeconomically stratified system. In recruiting for user research, take a close look at your criteria and consider A, who am I excluding with each question? And B, do I need to exclude this population to achieve my research goals? If the question excludes a portion of the potential participant pool and doesn't further your goals, consider removing it. Another FDA recommendation is to consider the burdens to participation some people may face. The barriers relevant to UX research focused on trust in large organizations, access to transportation, incentive amounts, and length of session and frequency of visits. Building trust is maybe the most difficult to overcome, but the FDA's recommendation works here too. Start with entities people already trust, like churches or libraries, and explore how you can work with those organizations to build your pool. In the example from the Accountable Care Organization case study, researchers went into the hospital, a place the patients already trusted and already knew how to access, and recruited there on site. Transportation can be a difficult barrier to overcome depending on where you need to conduct your research. If you have the flexibility, consider multiple sites or a site close to a public transportation hub. As the patient experience study showed, consider whether you can remove the need altogether and go to a place the participant is already frequenting for their own reasons. When you do need the participant to get themselves to you, consider including a transportation allowance in your incentive amount to help cover the cost of gas, public transportation, or hired transportation like Uber or a taxi. Regarding the incentive, weight the amount against what you're asking participants to contribute or sacrifice, and think a little bit beyond the norm. For instance, if you're interviewing parents of small children, consider that they may need to wrangle childcare in order to participate. If you can, consider including subsidies for this kind of barrier when you calculate the total incentive amount. While not specifically about the incentive, consider that some people you interview may work hourly positions and literally cannot afford to give up their time to you. Consider expanding your available interview window to include before and after normal work time. The purpose of this talk is to persuade anyone listening that this is worth acknowledging, discussing, and coming up with better recruiting practices. If we agree that demographic criteria has an impact on lived experience for you, for me, for our users, we should be recruiting participants that reflect the audience's makeup. We should be doing the work before the study to understand the demographic makeup of the audience, and then be insistent during the recruitment process on yielding the people we need to talk to, even when they're a little trickier to find. Otherwise, we're risking or even guaranteeing that the perspective we get will be relatively unidimensional. And if we think about those we're not talking to at all during analysis, we'll be making assumptions about their wants, needs, behaviors, and experiences. I've covered some of the tactics I'm trying and plan on continuing to try in my own research. These include insisting on specific quotas, making it easier for participants to enroll and attend, recognizing superfluous barriers in the screening criteria, making your expectations clear with recruiters, acknowledging the research team's privilege in hiring new perspectives, going outside your network for friends and family recruits. But as I said in the beginning, this is not the end of the conversation. I won't pretend to know all the answers. This is a conversation we should try to continue to have and evolve and iterate on. Does all of this mean that every study will result in differentiated experiences based on identities and characteristics? Does it guarantee that our research participants will exactly, precisely represent everyone in our user audience? No, it doesn't, and it shouldn't. But if we continue to work with homogeneous recruiting pools, there is a 100% chance that we will never hear those stories, and the unique needs of those populations will continue to be underserved. This is something we need to keep talking about and strategizing about, and I believe that collectively we can come up with practices, guidelines, and tactics that will help us serve the breadth of our users even better. Thank you all for listening. I have my email and my Twitter handle here. I'm going to end the slideshow and open it up for questions. Just give me 1 second. All right. So let's look in questions. All right, so I have, how do I convince stakeholders that this is important? This is a tough one, I think, especially if you're at an organization where there's a long-standing history of only talking to one kind of audience or person. And what I found to be helpful is to go in armed with the evidence you need to make your case. So in the instance with the healthcare organization where we wanted to ensure that there was racial diversity in the criteria, we went in with a barrage of information and statistics about how, particularly in Massachusetts, there was this disparity that broke pretty distinctly along racial lines. I've mentioned previously that when you solve for a more niche audience, you actually end up creating solutions that are more likely to serve the wider breadth of your audience. So, any solutions you create are likely to make the experience better, not only for the niche group you're creating them for, or the less represented group you're creating them for, but also for the audience as a whole. So, there's the business side case and the people side case, and both are, in my experience, pretty effective at making the argument that racial diversity, gender diversity, income diversity, all are worth including in the recruit considerations. How do I decide what the right demographic mix is so that I can ask for it? I mentioned in my case study about the healthcare in Massachusetts participants that we looked both at census data and at the existing user breakdown to determine the audience criteria. So I found the US Census to be effective if the client doesn't have a user breakdown by demographics already on hand. But I've heard a really compelling argument recently for over-recruiting for misrepresented folks in studies for 2 reasons. One, we've designed for one type of person for literally hundreds of years, and we've researched that same group of people. They are overrepresented in our studies historically. So it makes sense to me to overrepresent those who are not often seen in our studies when we aim to recruit them. The other is that you can't take an individual and treat them as a monolith, a representative of their entire race or their entire gender or their entire income level. So gathering a multitude of stories will help us balance what has been imbalanced in the past and reach some kind of equilibrium where we're starting to see those stories come out cohesively. I see another question in here. Asking specific demographic questions about potential users feels like it could be sensitive. Do you have recommendations or thoughts to share on how to approach this? Yeah, so this is something our team is still figuring out as we go. One approach is, especially I think if you're using more of a survey style to gather your participants, explain why you're asking for the criteria that you're asking for. If you're recruiting for race, explain that it's because you want to make sure you're getting a diversity of experiences and racial diversity in the voices you're hearing from. So providing explanation will make it feel a little bit less sketchy, a little bit less invasive, because you're not just asking for it for apparently no reason. And the other is to make sure you're covering the breadth of experiences you're asking for, right? So with gender, I personally found this one a little bit trickier to wrap my head around because there are such a plurality of genders, and how do we encapsulate that in a list? How do we ask that question in a way that is mindful of how people want to be addressed and how they see themselves? So really, it's evolving. There's a lot of research out there, a lot of people who are doing a lot of good thought leadership on how to ask each individual type of question sensitively and thoughtfully and conscientiously. So it's just a matter of spending time in the discourse and understanding where it's at, so that you can phrase those in the most effective, compelling way. Do you stop a project if the client isn't willing to recruit a diverse mix when it's needed? We're an agency, so we would not stop a project because of that. The best we can really do is make our opinion, our perspective known, be vocal about it, and that's something that ties back to the first question about how you convince stakeholders and clients that this is critically important. So our best is what we can do. And that's really the responsibility of the researcher, to bring forward the rationale, to do the legwork to convince people that it's important. And if they're not willing to listen, it doesn't mean you quash the study, but you keep making the effort until hopefully it's heard. That's my thought. There may be some agencies or organizations that would drop a project if they feel that the methodological approach to recruitment is not aligned with their goals. I would hope that presenting compelling emotional and statistical evidence that something is important would be sufficient to sway people when you pair it with a business case, especially. But sometimes they may not be swayed, and that's really tough. Let's see. Thanks, Laura. I'm so glad you're inspired. Other than learning from my own experiences and excellent webinars, what are some other resources we can learn from that inspire you? Oh gosh, well, there are two people I showed about going into communities outside your own safely and conscientiously. Both of them have done excellent prior work. I would also, I have not personally attended, but I've heard excellent things about Humanity Centered, Vivian Castillo's organization, to bring sort of more of the empathy side into the conversation and make sure it bleeds into the research effort. And Sakai Farai, who spoke at UXPA Boston this past year, has an excellent perspective on this as well. But we're really lucky. We're living in a time where there's a lot of thought leadership around this, and there's lots to explore and really dig your teeth into. I also fall back on some of my sociology literature from college to help inform my own perspective on this. Ijeoma Oluo, So You Want to Talk About Race, was my starting point when I started thinking about this talk specifically. But there's a lot of really, really good literature out there that, the pressure of being in a webinar, I can't remember all off the top of my head, but if you reach out to me after this, I will send you a list of those things that I'm most inspired by. All right, I'm seeing questions slow down a little bit. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to send it through. I'll wait a couple more minutes here. One from Christine here. Christine, thanks for listening. Oh, thanks. Thanks for sharing a nice note. I will say too, I'm really grateful that we have an audience for this. It's not always an easy topic to talk about, but I've seen the topic of race, equity, inclusion come up at numerous conferences over the last year or two, and it's really been wonderful to see the scope of the conversation expanding. So I'm grateful to have an audience for this. We'll wait just a couple more seconds here, see if anything else comes through. All right, I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for attending. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Happy to have a dialogue about this. And I mentioned that this is an effort that I don't think anyone should undertake alone. I think this works best if we collaborate and share thoughts and ideas. So would really welcome a conversation with any of y'all who listened. Thanks so much.